So in Chapter 6, we are working with discrete probability distributions. And the chapter begins by saying if we don't know anything about this data except for the fact that it is discrete and that we're interested in doing a probability distribution, then here are some formulas that we can use. Now, if you've read through the whole chapter, then you know that there are some special cases, such as if it's a binomial, if it's hypergeometric, or if it's Poisson. But we're right now saying, generically, if all we know is that it's a discrete probability distribution, then here are some formulas for calculating the mean, the variance, and the standard deviation. Now, I've had several questions about this, and so I wanted to kind of work through a problem that might help you. The first thing that we see here is the familiar letter mu, which is the population average, right? The population mean. And it tells us what we need to do. Now, I want to use this formula to talk about what's going to give you trouble in this formula. It's the order of operations. What this says is, this is a capital, it looks like an E kind of, but it's a Greek letter, and it's a capital letter S in the Greek, and that is sigma. Now, this little bitty guy down here, see this little swoosh symbol? This is also called sigma. It's lowercase s. Greek, right? We have capital S and little s. Think how different our capital cursive Q is compared to a little cursive q. Okay, well, the Greek letters have the same thing, but they mean something completely different. This capital Greek S sigma means to sum. Now, what do we sum? We sum, in this case, everything that's inside of these big square brackets. And the first mistake that students commonly make with this is they try to take a shortcut, such as summing up all the x's and then multiplying it by 1 if you sum up all the probabilities, right? And so you end up with some strange answers here. But it's important that we do this step correctly first, because it gets a little bit more involved down here, and we need to calculate mu so that we can then do this step, okay? Now, this step is not sigma, it's sigma squared, and sigma squared is the variance. And the very common mistake that students make is that when they're asked for standard deviation, they give the variance. And depending on the numbers that you're working with, they're different, but not quite as different as you may think, okay? So it's not like just really obvious that you've forgotten to do that step. So be on the lookout for that. Sigma squared is variance. Don't forget to take the square root to get the standard deviation. Now again, a thing that causes people a lot of problems in here is following the order of operations. I don't think that subtraction is difficult for any of you. I don't think that squaring something is difficult, or even multiplying. But I think that sometimes when we skip around or we do such a long process by trying to type it all in our calculator screen, that we run into problems. And what I'm telling you, the way to avoid the mistakes is to write down the intermediate steps, okay? Now, I like to use Excel for that. You know I'm an advocate of Excel. And even if you just use Excel to organize, maybe you don't know how to do calculations in Excel, so maybe you're doing those in your calculator off to the side, that's okay. Maybe you can start there, right? But ultimately, Excel is going to make it a lot easier for you, okay, and faster. So I would encourage you to do the extra credit work and to really start becoming familiar with this. Okay, here are some sample data that we have from that, and really I don't even need the dollar sign here with this 3. It is actually just a plain 3 in there. And I have the number of hours that people have parked. I think it's in our parking garage. And I have the frequency. And I need to create a probability distribution. Now, if you think about what a probability distribution is, you can think about the things that we did in Chapter 2, where we calculated empirical probability, which was nothing more than the relative frequency. So that's how we're going to get this P of x, the probability. Now, what is x? Well, in this case, x is our random variable, and it's the number of hours that people parked in the garage. Just so I don't forget that that is the variable of interest. Okay, that's our random. In other words, it's a changing number, and it's what we're interested in. I'm going to go ahead and insert a little line there, and I'm going to call this x. Now, as we're talking, I'm going to do just a little bit of formatting. Don't be distracted. This is just to help you see what we're doing. Okay, now that's one piece that I need to calculate the mean. So this is my random variable x. But the next question becomes, what's the probability that that x would occur? So we need to know the probability that one of these values will occur. Well, I have the frequency, and I know how to calculate the relative frequency. All I have to do is, first of all, sum all these frequencies. So I'm going to do that. Now I'm going to do a little formatting down here just so that we're clear. And the sum of all the frequencies is 228. So if I add a column, if I take each and every individual frequency and divide it by the total frequency, I come up with the relative frequency. And the relative frequency is the probability, right? So this is our P of x value here. Now, the neat thing about Excel is that once I calculate a value like that, I can simply select the cell, put my mouse directly over the, see that little notch right there? Put it directly over that until I get a thin black plus sign, and then press and drag, and what it does is it copies that formula. Now, why do I see an error there? Because as it copied the formula, remember that I want it to divide 15, then by 228, then 36 by 228. Well, Excel is smart enough to go ahead and say it's not cell B3 anymore, it is cell B4. And I don't know if you can see this on the video, but it did that. Unfortunately, what it also did is it said we don't divide by 228, which is the value held in B11. It increased that and said divide by B12. Well, how do I stop that from happening? What you do, I'm going to go back to the original formula here, is you put a $sign in front of the column, in this case B, and a $sign in front of the row. So $B, $11. Now, if that's too complicated for you, don't worry about it. You could do this calculation in your calculator and write these intermediary steps down. So I'm just copying it again. Now, whether you're doing this on your calculator or whether you're doing this in Excel, the one thing that you can see is something that we've already talked about, which is that there are many, many decimal places stored here, right? And even if your calculator is only showing you a couple values, it still knows how you came up with that calculation, and so it's remembering all those decimal places, and that is not good. It's going to cause rounding errors, and the problem specifically says to round each one of these values to 3 decimal places, and so I'm going to do that. I'm just going to retype these because remember, if you're doing this by storing it into a memory in your calculator, you're carrying all those decimals. I don't care if you're telling me that you can only see 2 or 3 decimal places. The calculator remembers all the decimal places. Clear it, write the values down, right? Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. 0.06, they said to what? 3 decimal places, 0.6, so that would become another 6. I'm going to come down here and say 0.158, okay? And just to save some video time, let me go ahead and finish that. Okay, so you can double check me on this. You can pause the video and double check. But since I've retyped the values, I'm going to change and call this column, where am I? Call this column my P of x value. And I don't even need this anymore, so I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, so here's my x value and here's my P of x value. Well, what the formula calls for me to do is to take each and every x value and multiply it by the probability of that x value. There are no shortcuts. I have to do it for each and every value. Now, when I say there's no shortcuts, Excel certainly makes this easy, because I'm going to take that value, multiply by its probability, and then just like we did before, I'm going to copy that to all the other cell values. Then Excel makes it easy to find the mean, because all I have to do once I have all these values is to sum them. See, I followed the formula. The formula said take each x value, multiply it by the probability of x, and then finally sum. And you can see that Excel, first of all, makes that fast, but most importantly, if I made a mistake, I can go back through and I can check my work. Also, if you organize it into a spreadsheet like this, which is nothing more than, a paper with columns and rows, you can email it to me so that I can maybe help you find your mistake. Okay, so now we know the mean, and I'm going to type that up here someplace. I'm going to say that the mean equals, and I'm going to come over here and say 4.16, and I might need to increase the number of decimals because, okay, so 4.160, I don't even really need to change that, because they asked me to do everything to 3 decimal places, right? Okay, so here's that value. Now, the next thing I need to do is to figure out this variance. And this is, we have now our formula for variance. And it says, I'm going to move this up here, it says that we need to take each and every x value and subtract the mean. So that's what I'm going to do, okay? And I'm going to organize a column so that, it's very organized. So I'm going to start out and I'm going to say here's my x value minus the mean. Now, as we know, when I get ready to copy this formula, it's going to change G1 and it won't consistently use this value, 4.16. To lock on to that cell, remember I need to have a $ in front of G, which is the column, and in front of 1, which is the row. Great. Now, all I have to do, copy that formula to all the way down, and in that way it's taken each and every x value and it's subtracted the mean. So what does my formula say to do next? Well, it says to take that value and square it. So I'm just going to write square in this cell. Easy enough to square, I just take that value and multiply it by itself. Right? And that's an easy way to do that. But if you really want to get fancy, the way that you do that in Excel is you do Shift and the number 6. That produces what's called the caret symbol. And then I can type 2, which means raise that to the power of 2. So that works out well, and I'm going to copy that down. Now all those values are squared. I'm going to pause for a minute because it said carry these values out to 3 decimal places. So let me retype those. And just to explain, what I'm going to do is say this value is 9.986, right? So I'm going to do that for each one. Okay, so you can see I have retyped these values. If you want to pause the video and check the math, I do make mistakes sometimes, but I am going to cut and paste those right over the top of the old values because I don't need those old values anymore. But what I have so far is just this little part, x minus mu. I've done that for each and every one, and I squared each and every one. The final step is that I need to multiply, by p of x. So equals, I take what I just did and I multiply it by p of x. Again, easy enough to copy that. In other words, I've done that for each and every one of my x values. Okay, so there's no shortcuts except for the fact that Excel automates the process a little bit. Now, what does the formula tell me to do next? Finally, after I've completed that process and written down each one of the intermediate steps, in other words, for this x I have all the information, for this x I have all the information, I've got it written down for each and every x value, sum. That's what the big letter sigma means, sum. And I would come up with 4.307 whatever, and I really should have rounded those numbers, right? Am I done? No, because they asked for standard deviation, and I have got the variance. So the very last thing I need to do is to take the square root, SQRT, inside of parentheses, and there, voila, is my answer. And that is the standard deviation and how we go through it and how you can use Excel to organize. Good luck.